I'm Eddie Spuhghetti, retro horror host and current co-producer on Mr. Holland's Opus 2, Holland's Christmas Concert. But I'm really sick of Christmas shit right now. So let's talk about something else, like another holiday. Halloween. I've started to notice a trend lately that there's a lot more interest and hype in it. Maybe that's because we're reading, watching, and listening about a lot more macabre things like aliens, ghosts, serial killers, and Michael Myers. And with a few more Halloween films on the way, I felt it would be appropriate to talk about one of the prior entries that is well known for rejuvenating the entire franchise, but I feel that the real story is what it went up against. So grab yourself a bowl of last year's Halloween candy, and let's settle in and talk about Halloween 4, The Return of Michael Myers.
If you haven't seen a Halloween movie before, here's a general history without ruining much. Yes, they do take place on and around Halloween, and the guy in the white mask isn't Jason. An important thing I like to point out about the Halloween films is that they never completely escape the perception of being realistic. Never completely. They do a little bit later on in the franchise, #Paul Rudd. Comparable franchises though, like A Nightmare on Elm Street or Friday the 13th, tend to contain more supernatural, surrealistic elements like dream demons or massive brutes who can just show up anywhere and throw people around like a rag doll. Funny thing is each of these core slasher franchises would pick and steal from each other in an attempt to catch up with the changes in audience appeal, and the Halloween series is no exception. 1978's Halloween came in at a time when the horror film was going through a transition of moving past its demon and religion-based fad. Monsters were out and psychopaths were in, specifically ones who kill with everyday ordinary objects. Since there wasn't a whole lot to compare it to at the time, Halloween was fairly fresh in its format and was highly received not only financially but critically, going as far to compare the motion picture to prestigious works before it like Psycho. And it completely deserves that, because director John Carpenter and producer Deborah Hill helped create the template for how every single element to a production supports the end result. The music, cinematography, lighting, story, sound mixing, acting, wardrobe, and so on. They all play vital roles in making the movie work, and if you were to take one out, the entire thing would start to fall apart. With a foundation of little over $300K, it grossed $70 million worldwide, and naturally, the concept of milking it even further was addressed with a follow-up. 1981's Halloween 2 was a unique concept, not only for simply being a sequel when sequels were not common, but as a true extension of the first film by continuing the story immediately afterwards and not weeks or years later. 2 is also way more visually graphic than its predecessor, containing a higher kill count, because within just 3 years since the first film's release, there had been so many different types of slasher flicks hitting the market that the standards associated with what made these types of movies successful had completely changed. It immediately became amalgamated along with its imitators and received poor critical reception, but despite all of this, it did make a fair chunk of change. About 23 mil back on a $2.5 million budget, which prompted production on a third entry to be released the next year. Halloween 3 Season of the Witch stands out as its own failed project when an attempt was made to steer the entire series into more of an anthology-styled format. Michael's Adventures was just one story that took place around the holiday. Here's another one. It did make a profit, but not as impressive as the previous two films, and with general negative reception, Season of the Witch disappeared as quickly as people realized Michael was not in the film. The reason you do hear very often nowadays about it is because it's actually a pretty good sci-fi horror flick. Audiences were weird in 1982. I mean, the top hit song of that year was Olivia Newton-John's Physical, so yeah, cocaine probably.
So Michael's story is over, and this attempt to steer the entire series into a Twilight Zone style format doesn't fare out too well. Halloween 1 alumni are moving on with their careers, but there's still a lingering interest in returning to a fourth film, knowing full well it would only be successful if Myers tagged back in.
One of the figureheads of the Halloween franchise is Mustafa Akkad, a director turned producer who helped finance the first film under the production company Compass International Pictures. Dino De Laurentiis Productions took over for Halloween 2 and 3 after Compass folded, while Universal took over the distribution rights. After Season of the Witch's poor reception, everybody sort of backed out and felt the series was dead, except for its creators and especially Akkad. At some point in the mid-80s, Canon Films contacted Carpenter about a potential fourth entry to the series, which he surprisingly did have an interest in revisiting. With Hill also returning to produce, the two chose novelist Dennis Etchinson to pen the script after previously working with him on the novelizations of The Fog, Halloween 2, and Season of the Witch. The latter two he was credited under the pseudonym of Jack Martin. The story would be set 10 years following the night of Michael's assault, and feature teenage Tommy Doyle and Lindsay Wallace, the two children that protagonist Laurie Strode babysat that same evening. Both characters are now suffering from PTSD along with the rest of the town of Haddonfield, as Halloween is now banned as a holiday, and the repression of it over the years has led to Michael Myers potentially being willed into existence again. Think along the lines of Stephen King with ghost-like elements. A non-Halloween themed high school dance and the local drive-in would be major set pieces, with the drive-in hosting the climax involving Myers going on a killing rampage. After a few drafts and several tweaks by Carpenter and Hill, Halloween 4's script is finalized and sent out to potential investors, while the group meets with Joe Dante to discuss his involvement as director. Eventually, the project hits a snag as Hill and Carpenter would sell their share of the rights to Akkad, who rejected Etchinson's script for being too highbrow, instead preferring the direction of Michael being a flesh and blood killer again.
This lost version of Halloween 4 sounds incredibly interesting, but I'm gonna side with Akkad here, because there's no way in fucking hell that I would take a chance on anything besides what has been proven to be successful, and that's essentially the first film. Compass International Films now becomes Trancas International Films, an affiliate of Universal Studios, and Halloween 4 is officially open for pitches, but they wouldn't settle on anything until a few years later. In the meantime, they decide to produce such classics such as Free Ride, starring Mike from Twin Peaks.
Dan Garten was a class act.
In early 1988, after hearing of the planned project, director Dwight Little and writing partner Alan McElroy submit their take for a fourth film, and Akkad accepts. However, time is of the essence, as the Writers Guild of America is little over a week away from going on strike. Little's main focus for the film is nailing the essence and themes of the holiday, while writer McElroy intends to honor the mood of the first two films while introducing fresh concepts. His final script doesn't deviate much from the finished product, but it does include an acknowledgement of Halloween 2's ending. This planned opening sequence was scrapped, beginning the weird trend where future entries in the franchise would constantly ignore the second film. With an approved budget of $5.5 million, Halloween 4 is greenlit and casting commences. 10-year-old Danielle Harris acquires the role of Jamie, the film's protagonist, narrowly beating out a pre-Sabrina Melissa Joan Hart. Veteran actor and Halloween staple Donald Pleasance returns to the role of Dr. Loomis, Michael's psychiatrist, adding not only a prestige to the production, but allowing it to connect to the previous films far better than had he not been involved. And under the mask of everyone's favorite lunatic is stuntman Tom Morga, who had previously worked on Friday the 13th Part 5. Morga fit the 6 feet or higher requirement that the producers implemented, and that was for a good reason, but we'll get to that in a bit. Principal production begins at the start of spring of 1988, just months after McElroy finalized the script. Salt Lake City, Utah stands in for Haddonfield, Illinois, and like the first film's production in California, dead leaves are imported to help maintain the fall appearance. Painted squash takes the place of real pumpkins, and makeup technician Ken Horn opens a crate full of duplicate masks for the iconic Fiend, forever immortalized as the Shape. During pre-production, Horn was given a mask by one of the producers who stated it was the mask they were going to use. Having worked for Don Post Studios, the company that created the original mask, Horn immediately saw that there were some major inconsistencies. The skin was now a pink flesh tone, and the brown hair had been replaced with a fair blonde. Horn took the mask as inspiration and contacted Don Post Jr. about using the Captain Kirk mold, which was what the original film's mask had been modified from. Some way or another, he was now facing a crate full of masks, but they were still pink-skinned and blonde-haired. Confused as to why they couldn't replicate the modified Kirk mask, Horn took the crate and customized them himself. Once dailies were sent back to the studio, it was decided that Tom Morga's portrayal of Michael wasn't cutting the mustard, so he gets replaced by another stuntman named George P. Wilbur. Some of Morga's scenes did make it through to the finished cut, but Wilbur would receive sole credit. During this point, Ken Horn is still dealing with more mask issues, as a producer has now requested to make the eyes bigger. This would involve not only cutting the eye holes, but also refitting a filter behind them that would need to be re-glued to the mask. Due to time constraints to allow for the glue to dry properly, Ken refused to put the actor behind the mask in any kind of hazardous situation, which resulted in Ken being fired. Upon hearing of this incident, a journalist for Fangoria who happened to be visiting the set approached that same producer and threatened to boycott the film. Half an hour later, Ken was back to work.
It's taken about 4 years or so to get another Halloween project going, with the main antagonist being Michael Myers, so obviously this mask back and forth shit can be a bit of a setback. But there was a much bigger hurdle that the production would ultimately need to get past. Despite script changes and the loss of Carpenter and Hill's involvement, something else happened during those 4 years that changed the entire playing field for the shape's eventual return. This to me is the most fascinating element to the entire fourth film. Michael went up against big competition.
Jason Voorhees, the main villain of the Friday the 13th series, became a household name, or at least his first name did. Though he was first featured with his famous hockey mask in 1982's Friday the 13th Part 3, and in 3D for that matter, it would take at least one more movie in '84 to really cement things. Things were legit when dollar stores started to stock goalie masks around Halloween. That very same year in November, we were introduced to a new horror icon, Freddy Krueger. Upon the release of New Line Cinema's A Nightmare on Elm Street, Freddy quickly became about as recognizable as Mickey Mouse, and would dominate the cinematic horror world alongside Paramount's Jason Voorhees for the rest of the decade. These two were the faces of modern cinematic horror, shifting things away from the common associations of Dracula or Frankenstein's monster. You could now instead use a graphic of Freddy's face to represent the entire genre. Midway through Freddy and Jason's reign of terror, Trancas International Films decided they wanted to bring back the dormant Michael Myers, but by mid-1987 you already had 3 Elm Street films and about 37 Friday the 13th installments, with a new Jason tale hitting theaters in May of '88, followed by Elm Street 4 that August. As a producer myself, I can absolutely bet that there was some hesitancy on the minds of the team behind Halloween 4. It could fail hard, thanks not only to the reputation lingering in the air from Halloween 3, but also from their new competition. While even less physically intimidating, Freddy Krueger could fuck you up in a million different ways instead of just stabbing you. Or the larger brute Jason Voorhees had a plethora of kill tactics up his sleeve, as the stalk and stab method had become old hat by this point.
Halloween's Michael Myers shows up. This is originally his turf, he's still king. He started this shit even though Black Christmas kind of did. And he sees this dick in a sweater next to Patrick Waugh on steroids, and he goes, fuck.
Remember when I mentioned the producers having a height requirement for the actor playing Michael? They took every measure to make sure he could stand side by side with the Titans of Terror but not appear to be the weakest of the bunch. If you haven't seen any of these movies and you go Google search Michael Myers, you may notice a lot of the photos depict a man in coveralls with a mask. Put emphasis on man. He is just a guy and not this hulking superhuman monster who can magically attack you when you're most vulnerable. Because think about it, Freddy is a demon and Jason by this point is a zombie. So how does this pretty strong yet mortal man fit in alongside them? This is such an important element to making Michael scarier than Freddy or Jason that the producers and writers of the recent reboot/requel went back to this format because, as I had mentioned earlier, it got skewed a bit in a later part of the series. It feeds off the presence of real-life serial killers and puts Michael in more of a stature alongside Hannibal Lecter or Patrick Bateman. Sure, they're a little more social, but there's a bit of the same sense of sophistication with Michael by keeping things more psychotic than going for the supernatural. And since Silence of the Lambs hadn't been released yet, producers chose to instead increase Michael's strength and kill variety in order for him to stand up to Freddy or Jason. Halloween 4 doesn't contain anything super over the top, but it almost gets there a few times. To be fair, the second film also did add in a whole boatload of different kills and very lightly conveyed a semi-superhuman strength of sorts, but it never went into the deep end. That flick also had a way better mask than Lieutenant Commander Data here.
In the end, for Myers fans, it was a thrill to see their old favorite back in the saddle, especially after taking such an extended break when the series suffered a critical blow. The producers also made some surprisingly good decisions when it came to ensuring the success of the film, such as putting Michael's name into the title of it and making sure that his face is in prominent view on all the posters, even though it's a little bit misleading. Mask issues aside, Halloween 4 isn't that bad, and while I get a little bit more into the plot of the film, per usual, I will not go too far to ruin anything.
Halloween 4's timeline goes meta by taking place a full 10 years later itself after the first and second film, involving an older Michael Myers chasing a relative of the hero from the first 2 movies. Returning is Donald Pleasance as Dr. Loomis, Michael's psychiatrist, and while he does the usual great performance as always, it's newcomer Danielle Harris that steals the spotlight here. As far as child actors go, she was one of the best at this point in time for being incredibly believable at her age. I mean, Miko Hughes was a lot younger when he did Pet Sematary, but hell, you could easily bribe him with cats or honey bunches of oats and he'll growl at anything. There's more depth here, with a little girl alone against the world and her only wish being a normal life with a loving family. Not so normal, though, is Michael's signature mask in this film, having a much more blank and bleached skin tone. Granted, his mask did get pretty banged up in the second film, so having a new one here sorta makes sense. However, all major advertisements featured his original one, which was completely the right choice to go with, because if he's coming back against big competition, you're gonna go all out and make sure it's obvious that Michael is legit back, and this isn't Halloween 3 Part 2, The Adventures of Dan Chalice. There's been a lot of confusion over why the mask was changed. First off, the original was long since lost, and most likely in pretty rough shape. Even story-wise, Michael went through quite a lot in the first two films, so most likely after 10 years it would be pretty deteriorated. And I think possibly that producers thought having a different looking mask would help things feel fresh, and that part of the magic from the first film was creating the mask again themselves. In general, us producers are never ever wrong. Now, I know this mask has its fans, but it's a bit hard to go from creepy defining facial features to this blank, I got this mask for $10 at Walmart. Despite the reasons why producers chose to go with this mask, they at least had the wherewithal to brand everything with the original one.
Also stemming from the original is the theme song, which makes its triumphant return to our ears and in slightly new form. Remember though, the music plays a big part in the success of these films, and without Carpenter involved, they got the next best thing: Carpenter's partner.
Alan Howarth had previously worked with Carpenter on scoring Halloween 2 and 3, and while his compositions here are enjoyable, it's lacking a je ne sais Carpenter that makes for an overall weaker result. The scores for the first 3 Halloween films lend to the atmosphere of their stories. It's even been suggested that if you watch the first film without the music, it's not as scary. I personally prefer the second entry score because it amps up the intensity by ramping up the synths. Just compare here this track from the first film that got a new coat of synth paint in the second. Halloween 4 doesn't really connect with its music on this same level entirely, but there are a few tracks here that stand out on their own, especially the intro of the film. Surprisingly, this is one of the best credit intros for any horror film. Eerie shots of Illinois farmland as the sun sets across several Halloween ornaments, preparing us for the night that all hell breaks loose again. The howling wind and Howarth's composition helps put you in that mood perfectly, reassuring you that this is Halloween, and he's coming home. The holiday atmosphere is overall far more expanded upon in comparison to the previous Myers tales, where Halloween decorations felt quite scarce. But there's a number of factors going into that, like 1978's Halloween wasn't even filmed around the holiday, so acquiring ornaments and such was most likely too difficult. Take also into consideration that by 1987, holiday decorations were much more plentiful than just your standard pumpkin. Fake cobwebs, smoke machines, cardboard graveyards, and just give it a few years until the Universal Monsters resurgence. Even 5 years ago from this video being posted, there were less decorations available at your local dollar store. Director Dwight Little made a great choice in making sure to broaden the holiday atmosphere whenever possible, resulting in Halloween 4 feeling more like what you'd assume a horror film set on Halloween would be like. Despite this being the first Myers-based Halloween film I've seen in its entirety, it's not my favorite whatsoever, and that's in part due to how great the first two are. Initially a trendsetter in the slasher film genre, 1978's Halloween has grown to become a much more important piece of film history. It really is an impressive example of how an independent production can be successful on a major studio level, and would echo a bit of Night of the Living Dead's accomplishments, not including that whole crappy deal with the copyright being placed on the wrong title. While Halloween 2 for some reason has become even more of a black sheep than the third film, I actually enjoy it the most, and find myself returning to it more often than any of the other Myers ones. The stakes feel higher, the score is very intense, and I prefer the main locale. There's enough here to satisfy me to a point where I don't necessarily need to go back to 4, especially because I don't have any important nostalgic tie to it. I bought a copy of the last VHS release of Halloween 4 in the mid-2000s, when I worked in the electronics wing of a grocery store. By this point, VHS tapes were on the way out and starting to fill discount bins, along with copies of the newly released From Justin to Kelly. It was one of my first jobs. I was quite young, not famous, and starting to discover more horror flicks from the 80s and 90s. In my past videos, I've been vocal about how I grew up with Universal Monsters and 50s sci-fi, and didn't start to deviate from that until one fateful Halloween night in a dark basement. But that's a story for another video. Back to Halloween 4, the box art looked pretty enticing, and it wasn't much of a gamble on a $4 tape, so I went for it. Strong intro, mediocre middle, a few bits that were neat, and then a strong outro. Once I saw 1 and 2 in full, I didn't really feel a need to revisit Michael's return. I didn't grow up with this film, or attempted to watch it on Scrambled, but I can imagine there's a lot of people out there that did, and the 4th film may be their favorite for similar reasons. And to that I say, meh, at least it's not from Justin and Kelly.
Halloween 4 was successful enough to keep the series going. Playing it safe had paid off for the producers, and horror fans were genuinely happy to have another major player back in the game. Though there would be ups and downs, reboots and requels, Halloween 4 deserves some acknowledgement for not backing down from very tough competition. And thank fucking God they kept the original mask on all the promotional, cause otherwise they would be totally fucked. Well, that's about it for Halloween 4. Thanks again for joining me. If you enjoyed this video, please check out some of my other ones where I talk about films and TV specials from yesteryear that kind of have a strange legacy to them, or maybe we're not really appreciating them for all the right reasons. Until next time, we'll do lunch.